July 3, 1825, 14 French warships entered the harbor of Port-au-Prince. They carried 528 cannons. They were not there to start a war. They were there to collect a debt. The distinction matters, because one of those things is remembered, and the other is not. Aboard the lead frigate, the La Circe, was a French naval officer and diplomat named René Armand, Baron de Mackau. He carried a document signed by King Charles X of France, an ordinance dated April 17, 1825. It had a title. It was called, with the full confidence of power that has never questioned itself, the Ordinance of Emancipation. The word emancipation, in this document, did not refer to the freedom of enslaved people. It referred to the freedom of France, freedom from its obligation to recognize the nation that had defeated it. What Mackau carried into that harbor was a bill. 150 million gold francs, payable in 5 annual installments, the first due December 31, 1825. In exchange, France would formally acknowledge that Haiti existed. That it was real. That the revolution that had ended 21 years earlier had actually happened. Haiti's president, Jean-Pierre Boyer, was given 8 days to decide. The fleet's cannons did not need to be loaded. The math was sufficient. Boyer signed on July 11, 1825. The document he put his name to stated, in the measured bureaucratic French of men who knew exactly what they were doing, the present inhabitants of the French part of Saint-Domingue shall pay, in 5 equal installments, the sum of 150 million francs, destined to indemnify the former colonists. The former colonists. The people indemnified, the people Haiti was required to compensate, were the former owners of the plantations. The former owners of the sugar mills. The former owners of the enslaved people who had risen up, fought 3 empires, and won. It was not the formerly enslaved who received reparations on July 11, 1825. It was their former masters. This is the story that power tried to bury. Not through fire, not through censorship, not through a dramatic act of erasure. Through something quieter, more durable, and far more revealing, the simple decision, made by the powerful and repeated by historians for 2 centuries, that this was not the story worth telling. We are going to tell it now. To understand what was taken from Haiti, you have to understand what Haiti was, what Saint-Domingue was, before the revolution began. In the 18th century, the western third of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola was France's most profitable colony on earth. Not most profitable in the Caribbean. Not most profitable in the French Empire. Most profitable, by some measures, of any colonial enterprise in the Atlantic world. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue was producing roughly 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half of its coffee. A territory roughly the size of Maryland was generating more revenue for France than all 13 of Britain's North American colonies were generating for Britain. That wealth had a mechanism. The French transported more than 773,000 Africans to Saint-Domingue, more than to any other part of the French Caribbean. By 1789, enslaved people outnumbered white colonists by more than 10 to 1. The conditions under which they were forced to work were documented by contemporaries with language that even those contemporaries found disturbing. The life expectancy of an enslaved person who arrived in Saint-Domingue from Africa was, by the late 18th century, recorded at less than 10 years. The plantation system did not sustain its labor force. It consumed it, and the slave trade replenished it. This was the machine. This was what 150 million francs was eventually calculated to compensate. The revolution that destroyed it began in earnest on the night of August 21, 1791, following a ceremony at a place called Bois Cayman in the northern part of the colony. The details of what occurred at Bois Cayman have been contested, mythologized, and weaponized by subsequent centuries of political interest. What is documented is the result. Within weeks, more than 100,000 enslaved people had joined an uprising that burned hundreds of plantations across the northern province. By September, the rebels controlled significant territory and had demonstrated something that plantation societies across the Atlantic world had been organized, at great expense, to prevent, that a coordinated, large-scale revolt was not only possible but survivable. The man who would become the revolution's central figure in its middle years was François-Dominique Toussaint, who had been born into enslavement around 1743 on the Breda plantation near Cap Français. He was in his late 40s when the rebellion began. He had been literate for decades, an unusual circumstance attributed to the relative latitude granted him by his enslaver, and had read widely enough to understand the political landscape of the Atlantic world in a way few of his contemporaries, enslaved or free, could match. He did not join the revolt immediately. When he did, it was with a strategic clarity that would define the next decade. He would come to call himself Toussaint Louverture, the opening, or in some translations, one who makes an opening. The name was earned. Over the following years, he managed the nearly impossible, maintaining the revolution's momentum while navigating between France, Spain, and Britain, three empires that each, at different moments, represented either an ally to be used or an enemy to be defeated. He drove British forces from the island after 5 years of occupation, at a cost to Britain of tens of thousands of soldiers and an estimated £60 million. He negotiated with American merchants to keep trade flowing. He drafted a constitution for Saint-Domingue in 1801 that declared all men free and equal, a document whose implications terrified slaveholding societies from Virginia to Martinique. Napoleon Bonaparte sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with an expedition of approximately 40,000 French soldiers in 1802. The stated goal was the restoration of French authority. The actual goal, understood by everyone involved, was the restoration of slavery. Toussaint was captured through a negotiated meeting that became a betrayal, invited to talks, arrested, and transported to France, where he was imprisoned in the Fort de Joux in the Jura Mountains. He died there on April 7, 1803, of pneumonia and, by the account of those who saw him in his final months, of deliberate neglect. The revolution did not die with him. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who had been one of Toussaint's generals, took command. By November 1803, French forces at the Battle of Vertières, the final major engagement of the war, were defeated decisively. General Rochambeau, who had replaced the dead Leclerc and had pursued a campaign of documented atrocity in his attempt to suppress the rebellion, surrendered to British naval forces rather than to the Haitian army, a choice that carried its own meaning. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared independence. He reached back past the French name for the colony and gave the new nation a name from the language of the Taino, the people who had lived there before Columbus arrived, Haiti, meaning land of mountains. The first black republic in the Western Hemisphere was 21 days old when Thomas Jefferson, then President of the United States and one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia, cut off all American trade with the island. Haiti would wait 58 years, until 1862, during Abraham Lincoln's presidency, before the United States formally recognized its existence. The world that Haiti was born into was a world that had decided, without a vote or a declaration, that it could not afford for Haiti to succeed. Dessalines was assassinated in October 1806 by political rivals. The republic he had founded fractured almost immediately into competing states, a southern republic under Alexander Pétion and a northern kingdom under Henri Christophe, who ruled from a palace called Sans-Souci and a fortress called the Citadelle La Ferrière, both of which he built using the same coerced labor that had characterized the system he had helped to overthrow, a moral contradiction that historians have never fully resolved. For the next 2 decades, the divided island negotiated, threatened, consolidated, and argued with France over the terms of its existence. The French position was consistent, recognition in exchange for money. The Haitian position shifted under different leaders but always encountered the same wall. France held the power of diplomatic legitimacy, and without it, Haiti remained isolated, unable to secure international loans on reasonable terms, vulnerable to blockade, excluded from the community of recognized states. Jean-Pierre Boyer unified the island in 1820 after Christophe's suicide. The king had shot himself with a silver bullet, according to the accounts that circulated at the time, when his soldiers mutinied, and spent the next 4 years trying to negotiate recognition from France without paying the price France was demanding. He sent 2 commissioners to Paris in 1824. King Louis XVIII rebuffed them. Louis XVIII died in September 1824. His successor, Charles X, reviewed the situation and reached his own conclusion. On April 17, 1825, Charles X issued his ordinance. France would recognize Haitian independence. The price was 150 million francs. The number was not arrived at randomly. It was calculated. French colonists and their descendants have been lobbying Paris since 1804 with detailed claims for the value of their lost property, plantations, equipment, livestock, and enslaved human beings, each itemized and assessed. The indemnity figure represented, in the view of those who said it, the fair market value of what the revolution had taken from its rightful owners. It was, in the most precise sense of the term, a valuation of slavery. 150 million francs was, at the time, more than 10 times Haiti's annual government revenue. It was roughly equivalent to what the United States had paid France for the Louisiana Purchase, a transaction that had transferred 828,000 square miles of territory and doubled the size of the American Republic. For that price, Haiti was purchasing recognition of its existence within its existing borders. A British journalist, reviewing the terms at the time, noted that the sum constituted an enormous price that was a figure which few states in Europe could bear to sacrifice. The French government knew this. Newspaper accounts from the period confirmed that Charles X and his ministers understood that Haiti could not pay 150 million francs from its existing revenues. The ordinance included a solution to this problem. Haiti was required to borrow the first payment from a French bank. The provision was not incidental. It was structural. Representatives of French banking interests were present at the ordinance negotiations. The bank selected for the initial loan was Toussaint, Randolph etc. The terms of the loan, Haiti would receive 30 million francs. The bank deducted 6 million francs in fees immediately. The remaining 24 million gold francs traveled from the vaults of Toussaint, Randolph etc. across Paris to the coffers of the French treasury, a short trip that launched a chain of debt that would not end for 122 years. This is what scholars have come to call the double debt. Haiti was forced to borrow money, at interest, from French banks, in order to pay France for the right to exist. The interest payments on those loans would eventually dwarf the original indemnity. The architecture was not accidental. It was designed by people who understood finance, who held all the leverage, and who faced no domestic political consequence for what they were doing. Imagine standing on the dock in Port-au-Prince in July 1825, watching those 14 warships. You are a Haitian citizen. Your parents, or your grandparents, or you yourself, survived the revolution. You have lived your entire conscious life in a nation built by people who fought 3 empires and won. You have also lived your entire conscious life in a nation that the world has refused to recognize, that American ships have been legally prohibited from trading with, that French warships have periodically threatened. You understand, because it is not complicated, that the ships in the harbor are not there for a negotiation. They are there because France has calculated, correctly, that Boyer has no realistic military option. The 528 cannons make the terms clear. What you do not yet understand, what no one in Port-au-Prince fully understands on that day, is that the document Boyer is about to sign will not be paid off until 1947. That the payments will eventually consume up to 80% of Haiti's annual government revenue in some years. That the banks that profit from the interest will use those profits to help finance a monument to liberty in Paris harbor. That the debt will outlast Boyer, and his successors, and the American Civil War, and the First World War, and the occupation of Haiti by United States Marines, who will march into the Haitian National Bank in 1914 and remove $500,000 in gold, transporting it to 111, Wall Street, New York, for safekeeping. You cannot know any of this in July 1825. You can only watch the warships. Boyer signed. The machinery began. The first payment came due December 31, 1825. Haiti did not have it. The loan from Toussaint, Randolph etc. provided the funds, minus the 6 million in fees. The money crossed Paris. The clock reset. The interest accrued. Boyer imposed a series of tax policies to raise revenue for the ongoing payments. Rural Haitians, who had fought and bled for independence and who had received land in some cases as a consequence of the revolution, found themselves paying taxes on their labor and their produce to service a debt incurred in their name, for a recognition they had not asked to need, calculated to compensate the people who had enslaved them or enslaved their parents. The economic violence was not metaphorical. It was documented, quarterly, in the payment records that historians have traced from 1825 through to the final transaction. In 1838, France agreed to reduce the outstanding principal from 90 million francs to 60 million, payable over 30 years. This is sometimes presented as a concession. It was a refinancing. The interest continued. The payments continued. The money continued to leave Haiti. By the 1870s, the bank doing the most profitable business on Haiti's debt was the Crédit Industriel et Commercial, a French institution whose executives and investors made, according to the New York Times investigation published in 2022, profits that sometimes exceeded Haiti's entire public works budget. The Crédit Industriel et Commercial's profits from Haiti's servitude were generated during the same years that the bank was helping to finance the construction of an iron structure on an island in the Seine River, a gift from France to the United States, the Statue of Liberty. Haiti's payment records end, in their final form, in 1947. By that point the debt had passed through French banks, through various refinancing arrangements, and ultimately to American investors, to the National City Bank of New York, which would eventually become Citigroup. The United States had occupied Haiti militarily from 1915 to 1934. When American forces formally withdrew, they did not withdraw American financial control. The debt payments continued, now serviced to American creditors. In 1947, the final payment was made. The United Nations, reviewing Haiti's condition that same year, reported that the Haitian population was often close to the starvation level. 143 years after independence. 122 years after Boyer's signature. The debt was paid. The New York Times investigation, published in May 2022, reconstructed the payment record in full detail. Reporters tracked each transaction across 122 years and calculated that Haiti paid approximately 112 million gold francs, equivalent to roughly $560 million in 2022 terms, to satisfy the original ransom and the loans taken out to pay it. Economists consulted for the investigation estimated that had that money remained in Haiti's economy and been invested in the country's development, it would have added at minimum $21 billion to Haiti's economic output over 2 centuries. Some models placed the figure significantly higher. $21 billion is the conservative estimate of what was taken. It is worth noting what the French government did with some of the money it received. The 1825 ordinance included a second provision that has received less attention than the indemnity itself. Haitian ports were required to offer French shipping a tariff rate half that of any other nation. France did not merely extract a cash payment. It secured a permanent trade advantage that further drained resources from the Haitian economy for the duration of the debt. The architecture was total. The debt was not a single transaction. It was a system. The history of this system is not taught in French schools. A 2022 survey of French historical education found it absent from the standard curriculum. Many wealthy French families whose fortunes derive in part from the indemnity payments have, in the assessment of researchers who have traced the genealogies, no knowledge of the origin of their wealth. The history was not censored through force. It was allowed to become inconvenient, and inconvenient history, in the absence of institutional obligation to teach it, tends to disappear. Former French President François Hollande, visiting Haiti in 2015, used a phrase that acknowledged the truth without accepting its consequences. He called the money Haiti paid France, the ransom of independence. He did not propose returning it. In 2016, the French Parliament symbolically cancelled the 1825 ordinance, a gesture that cost France nothing, since the ordinance had been functionally complete for 69 years. In 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron announced the creation of a joint commission of Haitian and French historians to examine the indemnity's impact. The commission was welcomed cautiously by some scholars. Others noted that commissions are announced when governments wish to be seen to act without yet deciding whether to do so. Haiti today is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Its capital, Port-au-Prince, is controlled in significant portions by armed gangs. Its government has been functionally collapsed for extended periods in recent years. Hunger is documented. Infrastructure is documented as absent. The causal chain between a debt imposed at gunpoint in 1825 and the conditions of 2025 is not simple. No causal chain across 2 centuries is simple, but it is real, documented by economists, historians, and international institutions, and it runs in one direction. Imagine standing in Port-au-Prince today, 200 years after Boyer's signature. The French warships are not in the harbor. They don't need to be. The work they came to do is finished. There is a category of historical crime that is distinguished not by its obscurity but by its visibility. The Haiti indemnity was documented from the beginning. The ordinance was published. The payment schedules were recorded. The bank transactions were archived. The New York Times reconstructed them, a century and a half later, from documents that were simply sitting in archives, waiting for someone to look. The crime was not hidden. It was normalized. The people who designed the indemnity were not operating in secret. Baron de Mackau returned to France and continued a distinguished career. He served as Minister of the Navy and of Colonies from 1843 to 1847, the minister responsible for France's remaining colonial possessions during the years that Haiti's payments were still flowing into French accounts. He died in Paris in 1855, a Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor, a peer of France, a man the official record describes without irony as having had a distinguished career in public service. Charles X, who signed the ordinance, was eventually deposed in the July Revolution of 1830, overthrown not for what he had done to Haiti, which was not a political issue in France, but for attempting to restrict the French press and dissolve Parliament. He lived in comfortable exile until 1836. His ordinance outlasted him by more than a century. Jean-Pierre Boyer, who signed the indemnity, is a figure of genuine complexity in Haitian history. He unified the island. He also signed the document that would drain his country for 122 years, and he did so under military coercion with no realistic alternative and no international support. The United States had refused to recognize Haiti, Britain was watching but not intervening, and the Caribbean's other nations had their own relationships with France to protect. To describe Boyer as having chosen freely is to misunderstand the nature of the choice he faced. To describe him as having had no agency is to simplify a man who spent 4 years trying not to sign before the warships arrived. What is clear is that he was trapped, by France's military power, by Haiti's international isolation, and by a world order that had decided, collectively and without coordination, that a successful Black Republic was a problem to be managed rather than a nation to be respected. The people who paid the price for all of these decisions were the rural Haitian peasants whose tax revenues serviced the debt. They are not, in the historical record, given names. They are present only in the aggregate, in the payment figures, in the poverty statistics, in the UN report of 1947 that used the phrase, often close to the starvation level, about people whose grandparents had freed themselves and who had spent their entire lives paying for the privilege. The greatest slave revolt in recorded history produced a nation that was then forced to spend 122 years paying the people it had defeated. That sentence is not analysis. It is not interpretation. It is what the documents say. The only question history has to answer, the question that commissions and symbolic gestures and diplomatic acknowledgments are all, in their various ways, avoiding, is what you do with a documented crime that was never punished, whose proceeds were never returned, and whose consequences are still visible every single day in the country that paid. France knows the answer. It simply has not decided to act on it. That is not a historical verdict. It is a present-tense fact about a government that has the records, the resources, and 200 years of silence on its conscience. The rebellion succeeded. The debt made sure it didn't matter. Asterisk, true history. No myth. No mercy.